I think the Foreign Secretary has been very clear that she will offer every support that she can. But at the end of the day, we have to be very clear who is responsible for this, both for the illegal, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and for this sham trial by a puppet government whose courts don't have any authority. And that's Russia. Russia needs to take responsibility for its responsibilities under the Geneva Convention for the treatment of prisoners of war. And it's very clear that these two individuals who are both established in Ukraine, part of the Ukrainian military, should be treated as prisoners of war.
Schools Minister Robin Walker is with us. Good morning.
Good morning.
We'll consider schools in more detail in the next few minutes. We're grateful for your time this morning. First, I do want to start with prisoners of war who have been captured. 2 British men captured by Russian forces while fighting in Ukraine. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss going to speak to her Ukrainian counterpart about these 2 men who've been handed death sentences. How much do you regret that the Foreign Secretary encouraged Brits to go and fight in Ukraine?
Well, I think it's the case that both of these individuals were in Ukraine long before any of that. These are people who had settled lives in Ukraine and have been fully signed up to the Ukrainian military. So it's absolutely clear that they should be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. And there is no basis on which they should be being put on trial and paraded in the way that they are. I think the Foreign Secretary has been absolutely right to condemn this completely and to be very, very clear that the rules of war for any country are clear on the treatment of prisoners of war. And there is no excuse for this kind of sham trial that has taken place.
What do the rules of war mean for the UK's intervention then at this stage to try to help these men and presumably to try to commute this death sentence?
No, I think we need to do everything we can at the diplomatic level to make representations to Russia, to show our support to Ukraine, but also to support the families of these people. And I understand that's what my colleagues at the Foreign Office are doing. I don't think this should make any difference to our overall support to Ukraine and continuing to provide material support to a democracy defending itself from unprovoked aggression. And that is something that I think it's absolutely right that we continue to stand by Ukraine. We continue to welcome and support Ukrainian refugees into the UK where needed. But more important, we continue to provide the diplomatic support and the military material that is allowing Ukraine to defend itself.
In terms of the diplomatic support being offered at this stage, it's not been particularly successful in averting the crisis as it currently stands in Ukraine. Are you confident that diplomatic efforts will be successful in avoiding a death sentence for 2 men?
I think the Foreign Secretary has been very clear that she will offer every support that she can. But at the end of the day, we have to be very clear who is responsible for this, both for the illegal, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and for this sham trial by a puppet government whose courts don't have any authority. And that's Russia. Russia needs to take responsibility for its responsibilities under the Geneva Convention for the treatment of prisoners of war. And it's very clear that these 2 individuals who are both established in Ukraine, part of the Ukrainian military, should be treated as prisoners of war.
Let's go on, if I may, to consider the cost of living, particularly in light of the news that the cost of filling a typical family car with petrol has exceeded, on average, £100 for the first time, which is notable, clearly, for the struggle that's going to be for people to refuel their cars. But also, I'm interested to find out from you what the government's planning to do with the, well, perhaps quite dramatic rise in tax that it's going to enjoy from the rising cost of fuel.
Well, the government has quite rightly cut taxes on fuel, and the 5p cut in fuel duty is the biggest cut in fuel duty we've ever seen under any government. But of course, this needs to be something that we look at the pressures and we do all we can to help. You will recognise that there's already in place a £37 billion package of support, which includes the increase to the national insurance threshold, making sure that people can keep more of the money they earn, help through benefits, help through pensions, help through energy bills. It's right that we look at all the tools we have to help people with these costs. But of course, I recognise that the massive increases in the wholesale cost of fuel are having a real impact. And it's absolutely right that the Chancellor keeps that under review.
How will you hold retailers to account to make sure that consumers are getting the best deal at a time of economic crisis? What does accountability look like?
I think this is really important that we do have visibility and transparency. Some of that consumers can see for themselves, but I think it's very important that we should make sure, if it's clear that retailers haven't passed on the benefits of that 5p cut in fuel duty, that's something I don't think the government should rule out any options to name and shame people who aren't. But I think what we do need to make sure, and as well, is that we're supporting people in other ways, and that's why I think the package of support the Chancellor has announced and then substantially increased. We're rising from £15 billion to £37 billion, can and will make a real difference.
Of course, the average cost of petrol has risen by 14 pence a litre since the government took 5 pence a litre off fuel duty. So that 5 pence has been all but obliterated, hasn't it?
And that's absolutely the concern, which I appreciate we need to keep responding to. But this is not one thing that is happening in isolation. There is a global inflationary challenge which we need to respond to, and that's why I think the overall package, the £37 billion that the Chancellor has announced, much of which is due to come into force shortly and start to benefit people, I think can and will make a real difference with this.
Something else that's slightly galling this morning, perhaps in the context of the pandemic and the cost of living crisis that we all now face, is news that protective clothing worth £4 billion that was bought early in the pandemic to try to stop NHS staff being infected with COVID is to be burned because it's unusable, a report has revealed. We're setting fire to £4 billion worth of PPE.
That's not something I'd seen, I have to admit, but it's something that...
From the Public Accounts Committee.
Right. I mean, clearly, there were huge pressures on government at the start of the pandemic. We needed to make sure that we secured as much protective clothing and vaccines and everything else that was required in as short a time as possible. I think it's clear that some mistakes were made during that time period, and it's right that there have been apologies for that and acceptance of that. I have to say, overall, though, in terms of the overall approach, we've been able to protect lives, we've been able to protect the economy. We've had a hugely successful vaccine rollout, and we were one of the first countries to be able to open up after the pandemic, which has put our economy in a stronger place where we can then afford this help with the cost of living. So I do think we have to look at the overall picture, and we have to learn the lessons where mistakes were made in a totally unprecedented situation, which ministers at the time were facing. I do think that my health colleagues, quite rightly now focused on catch up and on supporting the NHS with the huge challenges that it faces in the aftermath of the pandemic, are focused on the right priorities and providing that investment that is desperately needed in order to make sure that our NHS can continue to deliver for people, keep them safe and support people in living longer, healthier lives.
I should ask about 15 new mainstream schools in local authorities where outcomes for pupils are currently weakest. This is your announcement this morning. When can we expect 15 new schools to be built?
So this is a programme which we are opening basically for bidding today. That means that there is an opportunity for local authorities up and down the country to bid for new mainstream free schools where they are most needed. But particularly what we'd like to see is 16 to 19 provision in areas that don't have it, so children can make that onward progress and have better opportunities to go to university. As you say, we're targeting that, and we will give preferential support to education investment areas, the 55 areas of the country which being consistently underperforming. And this is also alongside up to 60 new schools in specialist education and alternative provision to make sure that we meet the very clear need that there is in that sector. That's as part of the £2.6 billion investment the Chancellor provided as part of the spending review in specialist education. And I think that will go a long way to meet what I know is real need across the piece.
Schools Minister Robin Walker, thank you so much. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks. That is Robin Walker joining us on Times Radio this morning.